This is Harvard on the Map, presented by the Harvard Graduate School of Design, covering innovative ideas and thought leaders in digital cartography, Earth observation, and all things geospatial, with your host, Jennifer Horowitz.
Welcome to Harvard on the Map. I'm here with Matt McNabb of Native, and I'm very excited to have you on the program.
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure.
So Matt, you are currently the CEO of Native, and for our listeners who may not know about Native and may not be as familiar with it, I'd love if you could maybe describe the work they do.
Yeah, sure. So we take the view that with the explosion of all kinds of new ways of sensing the world, from satellites to drones, LiDAR, and SAR, and so on, that there's certain types of content, certain types of things that you can't get or you can't know unless you're there. But historically, all the ways of being there, whether it's what people think and the polling agencies of the world, or it's building up Street View type capabilities in the Google Map teams or similar teams of the world, to knowing what pricing and product availability and store locations and the Nielsen's of the world, all more or less have some variant of the same process. You recruit a bunch of people, train them up, put them out in the field, and you have a whole bunch of people that are managing those that are collecting the data. It's an incredibly human-intensive undertaking. And the net effect of that is that it's incredibly expensive. It tends to be incredibly slow. And depending upon exactly what the content is that's being collected, this is variable by vertical, you often lose some of the underlying metadata or the context within which that data was collected. And we took the view that that's a solvable problem. And I found myself sitting in the White House Situation Room a number of years ago, the Obama team, and they said, look, we need to find some way of seeing whether or not a ceasefire we've just negotiated in Syria is working. And we need to know as close to real time as possible. And we looked at satellite imagery content, but you have the challenge, multiple challenges, but one of which is the revisit rate combined with granularity. Looked at social media monitoring, but you have the challenge of authenticity of the underlying data and its geolocation and evidence. And then there's locals, people there. And so we built a program pilot where we basically did all three between those sources of data. And we kind of walked away from that experience and said, not a lot of ceasefires in town. That's not much of a business, but a fundamental problem set is a solvable one. So we poached a number of people from Uber and other rideshare applications, built out a global dispatching system with the view that what rideshare and food delivery applications have really solved for, one of the things they've really solved for, isn't just the marketplace of that which they deliver, rides, food, etc., but the human logistics challenge of how do you recruit, train, manage, onboard, pay large fleet people, move them around the city, and ensure that they do perform the tasks that they need to perform, and do it at scale with extreme levels of efficiency. And with that view that was a solved problem, just not solved for the verticals of research and data, we set out to do that. And so since then, we've scaled up our network. We've got data collectors in 89 countries and 27 different languages that can be tasked on demand to capture observations or interviews or any combination of observations and interviews, all geolocated at scale, triple validated, so that if you have a question that you need answered that has a place and that can be verified, either through observation or interviews, we intend to deliver that at scale, cheaply and quickly, and democratize the world of on-the-ground data as a consequence. So that's sort of the ambition, is to be the fastest, most affordable, as well validated source of on-the-ground sensing available in the world.
Thank you. That's, as I've read about Native, it's great to hear it from you, and I have so many questions, but I know that you're a busy person, so I don't want to take up too much of your time. But first, I wonder how you sort of began working with geospatial data and how you kind of came to be within sort of geospatial location data realm in terms of your own background.
So I have a bit of a weird background. I am uniquely unqualified in a lot of ways for most of the things that I do most of the time, and also oddly, weirdly qualified in others. So when I graduated from grad school, I was really interested in kind of primary research, getting on the ground and actually engaging with people and so on. So I took a one-way flight to Pakistan and went out to the Pakistan-Afghan border and got to know local government officials, local communities, kidnappers, Taliban, these types of things, because I was more interested in actually understanding for real how things worked, rather than reading derivative insights on them. And it was a bit crazy, and ended up, creating an organization with some super talented people, an NGO that did research there, Afghanistan, Pakistan, a bunch of other places. And in that experience, it started to become apparent that having a really strong spatial understanding of what I guess some would refer to as human geography, but at the time I didn't think about it in that lens. I thought about it largely from the perspective of the communities and the context within which we would engage mattered intensely, and the relationship with space was actually highly political in a lot of ways. So my old boss and good friend David Cullen, one of the things that he used to say is, there are those that come into in DC, those that fly into Reagan National Airport, and then there's that. There are those that fly into Reagan Airport. There are those that fly into National Airport, and you can usually kind of better understand where someone's coming from based on which they say it's the same airport. And the place names themselves are incredibly political in that how you understand your world and how you relate with that world is then expressed in language and your lived experience. And so my background in geospatial largely came from the perspective of being grounded in more the social sciences and social science research of understanding place as a context within which people saw the world. And sort of building up maps and working with OpenStreetMaps and a bunch of others kind of with that in mind. And the more I did, the more I began to realize that a lot of that insight, particularly human geography insight at the time, kind of gets, on some level, gets left on the cutting room floor, because a lot of the people that are responsible for engaging directly with communities and catching, whether it's anthropology or quantitative research, certain types of qualitative research, often they don't think about it from that perspective. And that if you do, you can better understand the places that you're engaging. And with advances in technologies, smartphones in particular, the ability to assign it real coordinates has an enormous amount of value, and at times you don't know what that value will be until you later downstream. So that's kind of how I got into it. It was largely from that angle, and since then have been kind of accelerating by adding new tools to the toolkit, or ways of being able to get that type of data.
Out of genuine curiosity, why Afghanistan? Was that was it? Yeah.
I guess I was really interested at the time. So this was graduated from grad school, I think in 2005, I want to say. I think 2005, 2006. At the time, it was a really hot topic from a national security perspective, and I was very interested in that. There's a French film director, Jean Renoir, who once said in reference to his movie Rules of the Game, the terrible thing about this world is everyone has their reasons, and I wanted to better understand some of those reasons. And it felt at the time to me like the whole of the world was looking at Al Qaeda and Taliban and what was happening along the Pakistan-Afghan border. And I was offered a number of jobs, mostly outside of government. I was never really interested in working in government, but I was offered a number of different jobs that were very derivative. And I sort of said, forget that. I'm just going to go out there and do it myself. And yeah, so that's why there wasn't a particular passion about Afghanistan in particular. But subsequently, I ended up doing similar work in Syria and Yemen and Somalia and northern Nigeria and all the kind of vacation spots around the world. So
fascinating. I only ask because I am somewhat embarrassingly not a full CS major. I'm a CS minor, and my major was Near Eastern languages and civilizations, and I did my thesis on satellite imagery in Afghanistan and Iraq, and so I just out of sheer curiosity, I was just wondering. In any case, I wondered. So you mentioned how you brought people in from Uber who are working in the geospatial realm, and I think Uber's H3 geospatial indexing program is fascinating and fantastic. But I wonder, working in sort of the location data and geospatial realm, what changes you've seen in the past 10 years within this industry?
Yeah, well, I would say one of the I guess that I would say a couple of things that are very notable, at least to me. One is I guess the first is sort of an obvious point, but it has pretty significant implications, and that is the prevalence and availability of data generation. So the idea of in the world of like quantitative and qualitative field research, this is actually fairly basic. It used to be kind of generation one of that type of data was pen and paper. Generation two was pen and paper and a GPS, like a Garmin unit. Gen 3 was kind of moving all of that to a mobile app. And now, this is sort of a self-serving way of being able to articulate it, but I think what we do and what other companies like us do is moving away from thinking just about the point at which you capture the data and thinking about all of the aspects of geography down to, one of the reasons why we were really keen to bring on board some people on our team from Uber actually comes from their operations team, not their maps team. In thinking about how do we incentivize people in a very, very tight local geography to go out and perform tasks. So proximity and this idea that you have a large supply of people, in the case of Uber drivers, in our case, data collectors that are always connected to some and assigned effectively a place. And the ability to then optimize for proximity to say, look, I'll pay you $5 to go around the corner and answer these questions is a completely different kind of value proposition than recruiting a bunch of people and then putting them in cars and sending them out to go to those locations. It's a very, very different way of working. And that is only possible when geography is so intimately connected and pervasive as a data source. So I think that has been that's been one. And then the second has been thinking about space in 3 dimensions. So thinking about moving from a set of lat long to thinking about it from the perspective of like 3D point clouds, and the ability to sense the world, whether it's LiDAR and SAR and so on, but the fusion of these types of data together to be able to create 3-dimensional models that can support AR, VR, and those types of applications it's just incredible. And I think the opportunity space is huge, and we're very, very, very much at the beginning. In part because some of those sensors are old, and the ideas behind them are old. LiDAR and SAR, for example, not new, but the prevalence, the relative expense, and therefore the prevalence of those sensors is new. And with that prevalence opens up a whole opportunity space for this idea that, for example, Google Street View needs to be Google Street View, needs to be Google, it needs to be a hugely expensive undertaking, I think is very rapidly becoming a legacy notion. With that opens up all kinds of new industries. So I guess those two, the prevalence in general, ubiquity of sensing, and more specifically, to then take the next step of saying, okay, well, if you have the world so thoroughly connected and new sensors, old concepts, but new sensors with high levels of saturation available, your ability to then see the world in three dimensions is now actually becoming readily available to your average user. We're just getting there. So it's the beginning, but I think that's really exciting.
Fascinating, really fascinating to hear you describe it. I am second to last question, I promise. So I'd love if you could maybe describe just one or two of the things that Native's working on right now that you find particularly exciting.
Yeah. So we took this idea of saying, okay, well, let's imagine a universe where you can sit at your computer and effectively have a joystick on hundreds of thousands of people. I mean, not literally, but task literally hundreds of thousands of people, more or less, anywhere in the world, to get data that will help you answer questions. What would you ask them? And we specifically looked at what are the industries that have been stymied by the lack of fluidity and being able to ask a question and get an answer. And some of that is opinion polling and waiting 3 months to get an answer to what people think. But one of the things that we're really focused on now is working with Fortune 50 fast-moving consumer goods companies. So just the quick version of that, let's assume, and this is relevant to geography, and you'll see why in just a second, but let's assume hypothetically you buy a can of Coke in the United States. There is a 97% chance that if you buy the can of Coke, you're going to buy it from a big box retailer, a chain store, or online transaction. If you take the same can of Coke and you go to India, there is an 87% chance that you're going to buy it from a tiny little mom and pop shop that might not have been there yesterday, that might not be there tomorrow. And there are hundreds, in the case of India, literally millions of these across the country. That's known as traditional trade. It's the single largest channel of trade in the world. It dwarfs online transactions, any other way of consumer transacting. The problem is that if you're Coke and you want to know what's happening inside of the stores, is my product there? How much does it cost, etc. The way historically you've been able to get an answer to that question has been to hire a market research agency to send people out to go get answers. The problem is that if you're dealing with millions of locations, and those locations are highly dynamic, they change, they shut down, they open all the time. COVID just makes that worse. Then it is virtually impossible for those types of agencies to send people out to all the stores. So what they do is they'll send them out to a tiny little fraction, 1% or whatever, maybe less. And they'll come back with a pie chart that shows you a trend that says 17% of the stores don't have your product. The problem is if you're Coke, you need to know which stores so you can take action. And so by what we've been working on is, well, if you have co-location and ubiquity, that is, you have lots and lots of data collectors that are near and nearby to those millions of stores, and you're able to rapidly task them concurrently to go to those stores, you now have the ability at scale to get coverage to all of them at once, and to be able to have visibility of whatever it is that you want to know, from the store dimensions to the pricing and product availability and so on, or just simply where are they. That is something that is now becoming possible with what we built. And that becomes incredibly exciting because it gives you the ability to place what historically has been notional locations sitting in spreadsheets, often lacking coordinates even at all, to the ability to revisit them every few weeks or every month to understand what's happening. For us, what's exciting about that is applicable in the case of Coca-Cola or whatever in consumer goods. But the fundamental principle of that is true across many industries. That is the ability to locally sense at scale, that to the extent that you're able to remove the friction between people asking questions and people locally getting answers. If you remove that friction, then there's just so much you can do with that.
It's incredibly exciting, and I appreciate you sharing that. I think there's so much that Native can add to supply chain logistics and the geolocation, and I'm really excited to continue to learn more and to continue to hear about your work. My final question that I ask all my interviewees is to describe a time where you were lost, whether that's geographically or in your own life or career, and how you found your way back again.
So one of the things, this kind of actually goes back to one of the points that I made earlier about location, place names, and the cultural sense of location. One of the things that I did a number of years ago in the early days of my engaging with the mapping world was specifically with OpenStreetMaps and working in Liberia. And one of the things that I did in Liberia is in slum areas in Liberia, I went out with paper maps. So something that used to be called walking papers. I invested and we did some iterations of that to be a bit more sophisticated. But the idea initially that you would take a paper map, a printout of OSM with a QR code, and engage directly with communities and have them mark up the paper map as a way of being able to interface the online world with the offline world, so that they'd be able you'd be able to begin mapping things that previously had never been mapped before. So I did a lot of that, and I ended up there's a part of Monrovia called West Point. It was actually very heavily hit by Ebola a few number of years ago. But prior to that, I've been doing a lot of work in West Point, and this is incredibly dense urban environment. I mean, it's a very dense urban slum, and I couldn't figure out where the hell I was. I mean, I was I was in the middle of an area you sort of walk off the main road, and like if you don't know, it's not like there's street signs. I mean, you're in like a very tight, maybe I don't know, probably 3 foot width between structures and so on. And one of the things so I had to sort of, I'll be candid that I'm very bad with, I don't know, I was never a Boy Scout or whatever. I don't like orienteering, and so I don't know. So that's not a skill set that I have at all. But one of the things that I realized was that when I was there, that the location names that were used often referred to locations that no longer physically existed. And what I realized is that I would say, so for example, we'll meet you under the mango tree, but there's no longer a mango tree. And more specifically in Monrovia, when I was walking around, I was trying to find my way back to the main road, and everyone kept telling me to go to teacher's house. I couldn't figure out where the hell teacher's house was. And I only later realized that like a decade before, it was the house of a well-known teacher who had long since died, lived inhabited by other people, right? But there's no way of actually understanding kind of where you are. In a sense, I realized I was more lost than I thought I was. In that the way of being able to understand the space within which the space you inhabit, particularly in that context, is highly contextual. And so it was fascinating. We ended up building out maps with all kinds of POIs with cultural references like that we put on OSM and so on. I imagine I assume is probably still there on OSM. But I think that taught me a pretty real lesson about how intimate and how culturally specific place is and place names are, particularly in communities that define themselves in part by where they live. Yeah, so I think that was a very real experience for me, and better understanding. I thought I was out there mapping stuff because I could figure out where the water sanitation points was, but that really wasn't the the end of the lesson for me, so to speak.
Well, thank you for sharing. And I think, yeah, cultural place names are more relevant now, I think, even than ever. So appreciate sharing. And thank you for coming on the program. Appreciate
Thank you. I've loved listening to your previous episodes. And
Oh, thank you.